A little bit of a warning for you. Now for something different. I'm not going to mention the intranet word once. Well, I've mentioned it the once. It'll not get mentioned again. If you're looking for something techie, there's a little bit of tech in this, but not much. So for the second day of the conference, the afternoon, something just a little bit different. Before I start, I was going to say a few words about myself to kind of give you a little bit of context. If I go back far enough, and it's farther than I care to remember, I started out as a scientist with a degree in physics, and very quickly moved into the computer world, the software world. In those days, it was mainframe computers and core memory, you know, and 24K of memory was a lot of memory, but I'm going back a long way. And I ended up as a software developer and eventually as a software development manager. And I guess sort of the height of my corporate career, I worked for Lotus Development, if those of you remember Lotus 123, and hopefully Lotus Notes, which was I either get cheers or boos, which kind of predated the internet. Oh my God, I almost said the other word. I was really one of the early sort of collaborative platforms, and I did a lot of work with Notes, and what I discovered, what I learned was all the problems, all the issues were not really technical ones. They were all to do with the people. You could build amazing collaborative platforms that nobody would use, or if they did use them, they would abuse them in all sorts of creative ways. So over the years, I've just become a lot more interested in people, and as you'll see here, a lot more interested in the role of conversation in our business lives. So there's just a little preamble. Any idea who this is? Any idea where this might have been? Who it is? It's clearly a lecture, isn't it? You got some idea?
No, I was thinking about Socrates.
Socrates. A little later than Socrates, yeah. I think. This is Henry of Germany giving a lecture at the University of Bologna, I think in about 1340. So this is 700 years ago. And just look at it carefully. Not a great deal has changed in that time, has it? These guys here are pretty perky. He's asleep. He's reading something. Another guy asleep. Conversation going on in the back row here. And I think he's eyeing up the lady next to him. But take a look at this. I'm not sure if it's a man or a woman. Probably a man sitting there. What do you think he's doing? He's texting, isn't he? He's texting. Things really haven't changed in 700 years. So I'm going to keep an eye on you guys. Hang on, here's somebody texting here. Sorry, I'm not trying to embarrass you, but it's things haven't greatly changed. So have you ever questioned the lecture as a means of teaching, means of learning? It's kind of paradoxical that I'm standing here kind of giving you a lecture at the moment when I think you've probably guessed already, I don't particularly believe in the lecture as an effective way of learning. I think they're important. I think we need them. I think we're all familiar with the TED Talks and how much we enjoy the TED Talks. And you get provocative speakers like those of you who saw Dave Snowden speak this morning. He's as much as a provocateur and an entertainer as he is anything else. But it seems that all the research shows that the lecture isn't a terribly effective way of teaching. This is a British educationist called Donald Clark, and he says, show me a professor of education who still lectures, and I'll show you a hypocrite who hasn't read the research, which is pretty scathing. I first started to question the lecture 12 years ago, 13 years ago, back in 2002. I used to go up to London to listen to some knowledge management talks in the evening. They were free. They were organised by some alumni from the Cass Business School. They're the sorts of talks you'd get in the evening. You'd have a speaker, time for Q&A, and again, in true British tradition, and I suspect Danish and Scandinavian tradition, we'd go down the pub afterwards. And some of those talks were good, but I reckon probably 8 out of 10 of them were dire. They were death by PowerPoint. You know, how can somebody who's got maybe 30 minutes to speak have over 100 PowerPoint slides? And on many of those evenings, what do you think the best part of the event was? The pub. And it wasn't just the beer, it was the conversations that we had down the pub afterwards. It seemed to me that was the place where people were really engaging with the topic, with the subject matter, and asking questions and maybe seeking out the speaker if the speaker would come down, and having that dialogue. And what I wanted to do was kind of like bring the pub into the lecture theatre. You can't quite do that, but I wanted to bring some of the principles of the conversations that we're having down the pub into the room and make things more conversational. And so I started running these things that I call knowledge cafes back in 2002. And the other day I was walking past the Strand Hotel, this is it here, and thinking back at that, it was 12 years since I started running them. Now, more by accident than anything, I've ended up running them regularly in London. I run about 6 of them a year. They're public events, they're totally free. But I've also ended up running them all over the world, and I'm slowly sort of colouring the world red. If it wasn't for Africa, it would I would be getting some good coverage there. And I've learned a lot about conversation and a lot about people and a lot about culture. And I've really discovered that if you take the fear out of conversation for a lot of people, because a lot of people, a lot of cultures are actually afraid to speak up, the format that I've developed works extremely well, and people will open up and engage and fundamentally speak their minds, in the same way that you do tend to do in the pub, especially after a beer or two. So this is something I've sort of learned over the years. And I haven't really defined what the cafe is. This is one I ran a few years ago, 2 years ago in London, and you can get a feel for the kind of degree of engagement. I don't know what these women were talking about, but it's clearly quite a engaging conversation. And I love to watch people and watch their body language. I often think if we had to sit on our hands when we were having a conversation, it wouldn't be quite the same. I think discovered that actually, for some strange reason, women from Colombia seem to be the best, I say best conversationalists, but best in the sense that they speak with their whole bodies. They lean forward, they bring people in. It's not just maybe someone like myself, sort of a more traditional Brit, I'll be a lot more formal. But you get the idea. But basically, the idea of the cafe as it started out was to bring a small group of people together to have a conversation around a topic of mutual interest. And I'll very briefly describe the process in a moment. But the whole idea is to learn from each other. And in actually having that conversation, you often get to learn what you actually get to know, because you're articulating it for the first time. So it's about gaining a deeper understanding of an issue, exploring issues, exploring possibilities. But also it's about building relationships, about connecting people. In organizational life, it's about breaking down silos. And really that's sort of independent of whatever the conversation might be. So this is the essence of the cafe. So I'm not going to go into a great deal on the process. I know one or two of you here were at my workshop on Tuesday, where we looked at the process in some detail. But basically the idea is that the speaker, I still have a speaker normally, but the speaker might only speak for 5 minutes. At the very most 20 minutes. I think that's sort of about the limit. And poses a question to the group. And there's a lot of effort that kind of goes into thinking what makes a good provocative question. And then what I found over the years is that the best way for the cafe to work is when people are sitting in small groups of 3, 4, at the most 5 people per table. So this is a good example here. I often say that to have a good conversation, you need to be sort of in touching distance of the other person. Not that you necessarily need to touch them. But, everyone can hear each other, everyone can see each other. Seems what the research has shown, that if you've got 6, 7, or 8 people in a group, which often is what you've got, say, at conferences, where you've got the larger tables, you don't get a conversation in the sense that you've got a little ping-pong ball bouncing back and forth as part of the conversation, but it's a series of monologues. People do kind of little mini presentations to the group, and then somebody steps in and they take over sort of the baton and continue the presentation. It's not, you just haven't got that dynamics and the interaction that you have with a smaller group. Also in a larger group, of course, some people can go the whole of the session without saying anything. If you've only got 3 or 4 people, it's almost impossible not to join in the conversation. Usually have 3 rounds of conversation that last about 10 to 15 minutes. I bring everyone together at the end in a circle. Here's a circle here, and we continue the conversation in a circle. Again, what I found is that the cafe works best, maybe 16, 20 people, though I've done it for as many as 50 or 60, but it's not quite the same. It's just that little bit too large. But it's surprising, actually. I can take a room full of 50 people and get them to form a circle, and we don't need microphones, and we can continue that conversation in a circle. The circle is really quite a leveler. Everyone can see each other, everyone can hear each other, everyone can engage. Question? One question I don't understand. You say 3 rounds of conversation. Is that because you propose 3 questions? No. Okay. Let me explain. So pose the question. I don't have any table leaders, so people simply have the conversation at their table. After, say, 15 minutes, I say, now, could a few people change tables, move tables? They move to another table, and they continue the conversation. Same question. I'm trying to keep it simple. I'm trying to not have too many rules, too many regulations. I'm trying to get it as like the minimal amount of structure to kind of almost duplicate the sort of conversation that you might have in the pub. Clearly, can't quite do that, but that's the essence of it. So these are some of the principles behind it. I'm trying to generate that relaxed conversation. Everyone's equal. It's, I think, a key principle. So I don't have any table leaders. I'm not going to ask for each table to say, appoint someone to report back. I tell people that I'm not going to force anybody to do anything they don't want to do. Sometimes I get people, they'll phone me up and say, David, I'd love to come to one of your cafes, but I'm really rather shy. Can I come and just listen? And I say, yes, fine. It's not a problem. But of course, invariably when they come, they always tend to engage in the conversation. I also say it's okay to go off topic, because I think so often, in a pub, you don't have somebody telling you, what you can and what you can't talk about. And the whole idea here is to, the talk and the question is to seed the conversation and then let the conversation, if you like, take charge and take the people in many ways where the conversation wants the people to go. And it's not about making decisions or coming to some degree of consensus. It's fundamentally about learning from each other. But I could talk a lot more about the process, but I don't particularly want to do that this afternoon, should I say.
You want to give an example of the question that you posed at the beginning?
The one I did yesterday, the day before in the workshop, I talked about the knowledge cafe, and the question there was quite simply, what applications do you see for knowledge cafe? So that was a nice simple one. And one of the ones I use in sort of a KM context, I'll talk a little bit about knowledge sharing, and then pose the question, what are the barriers to knowledge sharing in your organization, and how do you think you might overcome them? So, it's what I always say with a cafe, it's about starting with a purpose, figuring out what it is you want the cafe to achieve, and then that leads you to the talk, it leads you to the question, and the conversation that follows from that. And I've run them not just on knowledge management and business, I've run them on global warming and child poverty and a whole load of different issues. Okay? But, as I say, so I've been running these cafes pretty much all around the world for the last 10 years. And what it's done is sort of open my eyes to conversation and the importance of conversation. It sort of made me realize that we tend to take it a little bit too much for granted. And I felt the need to kind of, it's like put a few labels on things, and one of them is something I could call organizational conversation. And I simply say that organizational conversation is those sort of myriad of little conversations, both formal and informal, that we have every day in our organizational lives, that we just take for granted. If you think about it, it's almost as if that conversation is the lifeblood of the organization. It's where the information is really flowing. You know, it's probably not flowing. I'm going to use that word, intranet. It's probably not flowing through. Well, clearly it is flowing through the internet, but you know, the messy, more social stuff is flowing through the conversations. Now, I'm not the only one to kind of recognize this over the years. This is David Weinberger, who was one of the co-authors of the Clue Train Manifesto. I'm sure a few of you are familiar with that book, quite an amazing book from 12 years ago. He says that business is a conversation because the defining work of business is conversation quite literally, and that as knowledge workers, our job is to have interesting conversations. He doesn't even say productive conversations, he says interesting conversations. And in a similar vein, Alan Weber, in the Harvard Business Review a few years back, said that conversations are the most important form of work, so much so that the conversation is the organization. A very interesting way of looking at the organization, very interesting way of thinking about conversation, something that I'd never really thought about, I think, before I started running the cafes, because as I say, we just take conversation for granted. And what I've realized over the years, and increasingly in recent years, you know, is that conversation is a little bit of a Swiss Army knife. There are so many different purposes we can put it to if we choose to. You know, we can be kind of conscious about the way that we use conversation. And I've just listed some of the more obvious ones here. By the way, most of the photos that you see here are photos from past cafes. I've sort of developed a little bit of a fetish, I guess, of actually taking photos of people in conversation, because I just like to see the passion that exists there at times. So sort of began to kind of realize just the power of conversation, and start to realize that it's not just the knowledge cafe. There are lots of other conversational tools, and I've just listed some of them here. And these are all face-to-face tools, because it's really face-to-face conversation I'm more interested in than computer-mediated conversation. And some of these you'll recognize, some of them you won't. But these are a lot of tools that, again, most organizations don't actually use or apply. I mean, I've been running the knowledge cafes for 10 years or so. There's a similar process called the World Cafe that's, it's 20 years old this year. And some organizations have picked up on that process and use it quite regularly, but most organizations don't. So sort of recognition that there are lots of other conversational methods. And what I want to do now is share with you just a few little, not so much stories, but just little examples of how I've seen organizations either use the cafe in sort of quite creative ways, or use conversation in their organizations to, you know, sort of specific ends, and some of them are really quite creative. This was a key one. This happened very early on when I was running the cafes, and you just asked me the question about what sort of questions do I ask. I'd run my first knowledge cafe inside an organization. It was the International Securities Network in Zurich. And I had a small group of about 30 people. And the question I posed to them was exactly that. What are the barriers to knowledge sharing in your organization, and how might you overcome them? Now, normally in the cafe, I don't capture anything. I don't get people to write things up on flip charts. And I'd got just a minute or so into the conversation, and one of the women managers stood up and said, "David, stop. We need to stop." I thought something was terribly wrong, and she said, no, it's not, there's anything wrong. She said, but we need to capture what's going on. What I hadn't realized, there were 3 departments in the room, and this was the first time they'd ever really talked to each other. And they were discovering all sorts of issues and problems, and some of them really quite obvious ones. They did research on international security, both sort of pandemics and terrorism and global warming, and wrote reports. So you've got one researcher here working on a report for one client, another researcher here working on a report for another client, but the brief is exactly the same, or very, very similar, and they weren't aware of it. You'd think that wouldn't happen, would you? So once they knew that, once that had come out, then clearly no real permission or additional resources needed. They get to get together for a further coffee the following day and figure out how they can work together and make the best use of their resources. I mean, it was interesting because a lot of the issues that surfaced kind of fell into that category. They were things that people could very easily do for themselves without any real permission or resources needed. And then there were other things that were a little bit more substantial. I'm going to use the word intranet again, actually. One of the things they discovered was that the people in the organization really, really hated the corporate intranet. They knew it wasn't liked, but they didn't realize the depth of the distaste for the intranet. But that was then something that had to be escalated to senior management. That wasn't something that the people themselves could solve. But most of the issues were things that people could solve if only they had been talking to each other. So this was a big eye-opener for me. And this was something that the guy, Ed Polaris, who invited me in, wrote about the impact of the cafe, I think 6 months later. So for me, say that was, I think, the first time I really started to appreciate the power of bringing people together to have conversations in an organization. So that's one. This is a very simple one I learned about just a few weeks ago. And this is Hong Kong MTR. When they're looking for customer feedback, they don't go out with clipboards and questionnaires. They basically have put coffee booths on the stations. They've even put coffee booths on the commuter trains, and they invite people into coffee, and they have a conversation, with a small group of people, and they listen in to the stories and things that they've got to tell, and they get their feedback that way. So again, very simple application of using conversation. And this one's an interesting one, and rather than describe it, I'll just play you a little video that I think says it all.
So David was talking about when it's appropriate to have a knowledge cafe versus when it's appropriate to have an agendaed meeting with decision making. And it reminded me of when I was a new project manager and having quite a consensual style of leadership. I found it quite difficult to decide when it was appropriate to get other people's opinions and when I had to make a decision and take some authority. And so the way I dealt with this, because sometimes the meetings became quite chaotic because we were both having opinions and then trying to make decisions all at once. So the way I dealt with this was to have 2 separate meetings. So first of all, to set up a meeting where my whole project team could give their opinions and give their thoughts about what we should do. And then to go away, have a think, make up a plan, and to come back for a second meeting and say, okay, now this is where we decide what we're actually going to do. Here's the plan. You can give further opinions, but what we need to do at the end of this meeting is not have a lot of ideas, but have a decision. And by separating those two phases, I think it made it easier for people to understand when they were giving ideas and when some decision was required.
Again, very, very simple idea. When I think back to my corporate life, the number of times I was in meetings where there were two factions, usually the senior people or the more dominant people, who'd already made up their mind as to what the decision should be, and they saw the meeting as a mechanism for imposing that on everybody else. And there were others, and I tended to fall in this category, who felt that we needed to explore the options a little more. We needed to have some conversation around it, and of course there'd be a big bun fight as to who was going to win. And of course it'd be usually the dominant people would tend to win, and there maybe wasn't sort of sufficient time given over to exploring other options. And this is just a very simple way of breaking that meeting into two. So the first meeting is very cafe-like, and the second meeting is more traditional, where, you know, at the end of the day, you've still got to make a decision. Very, very simple application here. This is a lady called Valerie Waters in Trinidad, working for Trinidad Tobago Oil and Gas. They used to bring in expert speakers at lunchtimes to talk about some oil exploration and what have you. And they simply turned those events into cafes, and they actually did it in an internal cafe. So you can see here sort of tablecloths and things. And so again, rather than having a speaker and then a Q&A, they had a speaker, and then they turned it into a cafe so people could get to talk and engage with the subject matter. Again, very, very simple way of making use of the cafe inside of an organization. This one I love. I don't know how many of you have come across this gentleman. His name's Theodore Zeldin. He's as crazy as he looks with that massive white hair. He's an Oxford historian. He does things called conversation dinners, where he brings strangers together. Maybe not quite like Kurt's been doing here, because he brings people together in pairs. And they have dinner together, and they get to choose from the food menu, but they also have a conversation menu. So when they come to have their starter, they not only choose their starter, but they choose what they're going to talk about over their starter. And I did a cafe a few years ago for the European Training Foundation in Turin, and we had dinner the night before, and they actually produced a little knowledge menu. Actually, probably far too many questions, but people could choose the questions that they wanted to talk about over dinner. Again, really, really simple idea. This is a slightly more sophisticated one, and one I particularly like. This is ING Bank in Amsterdam. Most organizations have got sort of maybe some sort of competitive intelligence group or department, you know, that look out and scan what's going on in the world, whether it's sort of a new competitor, you know, a new product, regulation, especially in the banking industry. And they produce reports that they then distribute by email, maybe to the rest of the organization. What they do in ING Bank, which is a little bit different, is when they spot something that's important, and of course in the financial world there's been an awful lot going on, an awful lot of new regulations, then they bring together the people who they think it's going to impact, and they run a knowledge cafe around that issue. Not so much at the time to make decisions, but to figure out what the likely impact is, or what the likely opportunity is, or what the risks are of whatever that new development might be. And I often think this is a nice way of differentiating between information management and knowledge management. This essentially is about information gathering and distribution. And this is done sort of through the technology. This is about bringing the people together to better understand the information. And to my mind, that's the essence of what knowledge management is all about. So a few examples there of how I've seen organizations use conversation. Just want to share this one with you because it's a little bit different, and it's one of my favorite applications, if you will, stories. Not too sure quite what to call it. It's got this fancy name called randomized coffee trials. Don't be put off by the name. It's got a little bit of history that I won't go into. But the essence of the randomized coffee trial is that people in an organization who take part in this so-called RCT are randomly matched with each other. So two people are randomly matched each month and given, say, 20 minutes, 30 minutes to have coffee with each other. That's it. That's the basic idea. And I don't think this video's, no, actually, I had a little video there, but we removed it because it wouldn't play for some reason. But basically, it was developed by an organization in the UK called Nesta. And they just wanted to bring people together, if you like, for the serendipity that they felt that would generate. That you never quite know what's going to happen when you bring two people together. New ideas, new relationships, again, spotting new problems, new issues. Again, about building relationships across the organization. And one of the organizations that have done this is the Red Cross, Red Crescent, and they've got 450,000 volunteers around the world. And the guy who invented this, if you will, a guy called Michael Sotto, he's left the company and created his own organization called Spark Collaboration that handles the matching. Because if you've got just a few people, you can put names in a hat and pull them out. But if you've got 450,000, you need a little bit of computer power to crunch that. And he's making that software available for free to NGOs and sort of charitable organizations. And what they're doing each month is that some people get connected up at random in another country. So one volunteer, maybe in Egypt, gets connected with a volunteer in California. And now they have a virtual coffee. They do it over Skype. And I just think that's just a brilliant idea. It's been catching on pretty rapidly. These are some of the organizations that I know are running RCTs. Some of them are doing it a little bit differently. I took it off here because I used this slide in the Middle East, and I couldn't use the one example that I quite like. Sab Miller in the UK, which is a brewer, they don't have randomized coffee trials. They have randomized beer trials, and people come together for a beer. But I couldn't use that example in Dubai. Who else uses this differently? Oh, the Bank of England. They use it in their IT department, and they bring 4 people together once a month. And although Nesta kind of recommend that you let people talk about anything they want to, what they do is they actually give them something to talk about. They give them a business problem or an IT problem that they're supposed to talk about. But I don't think they actually force them to do that. So again, really quite some interesting idea. Now, I just want to kind of just draw to the close and just share with you something that I'm thinking about and developing, and it's something that I'm calling conversational leadership, because what I've really been doing here is sort of taking you through a story from those 10 years ago when I first started running the cafe, and sharing with you, some of the things I've seen along the way. And in that time, I've just started to appreciate more and more, as I say, the power of conversation. And what I'd like to see now is organizations taking conversation much more seriously. And I define conversational leadership like this. I simply say it's a style of working, where everyone understands the power of conversation, and takes a conversational approach to the way that they work, and the way that they connect and relate with each other. So in some ways, it's almost as simple as that. It's getting people to recognize the power of conversation and take it more seriously. And I've just broken it down into a few kind of key areas. I think all of us have got the power to take a more conversational approach to our work. You see so many people who, they have coffee at their desks, they have lunch at their desks, they communicate to the person next to them by email, and it's it's not so easy if you're in that habit, but the whole idea here is that there's so much more that we could be doing face-to-face. It makes sense to have lunch with other people. It makes sense to walk the coffee machine and have the conversation over coffee. It makes sense to use email less and maybe pick up the phone a little bit more. It's not quite a face-to-face conversation, but it's a conversation nevertheless. So there's so many little things that we can do to take a more conversational approach to our work. I think the other part of it, and you probably all know people who do this, and you may well do it yourself, and that's about being a connector and being a catalyst. When you meet somebody and you realize that they've got a passionate interest in a particular area, and you've got another friend or colleague who they don't know who's got a similar interest, you bring them together for coffee. You act as that connector. And if we go back to all those conversational methods I talked about, peer assist, after action reviews, the Knowledge Cafe, the World Cafe, again, starting to use those conversational methods on an everyday basis. Again, a little bit more work and effort to do that, but not necessarily a huge amount. But I think the key area here is something I'm calling a conversational architect, somebody who deliberately designs and convenes maybe more strategic conversations within the organization. And let me just explain that. The background to this, as we all pretty much aware, is that the world is changing very fast. It's a lot more complex than certainly when I started out working, 40-odd years ago now, I guess. Certainly, managers often know less than their people, and one person clearly can't know everything. So when it comes to making sense of the world, making sense of the opportunities out there, the problems, the risks, the opportunities, really you need to bring a group of people together to have an open, creative conversation around that particular issue. And this is sort of the essence of creating, let's say, a so-called strategic conversation. And I think probably the best people to do that are actually the managers. They're the people who are in the position to convene those conversations. And I think one of the best tools, that they're not the only tool, to bring people together is the cafe. So you've got an issue, you've got a problem, you've got a new competitor, you've got a new opportunity, a new piece of technology, you want to figure out what it is you're going to do. Then, a manager here is in a position to actually design and convene a conversation, to invite in the right people, and to really get so what I call a creative conversation around the topic, rather than just one or two key people making the decision. So this is the essence of what I'm calling conversational leadership. If you're interested in this area, I won't go through it now. I'm not too sure what Kurt's doing with the slides, but you can have access to these slides. There are a lot of other people talking about conversational leadership. There was a book published last year called Talk Inc. by a couple of American researchers that set out to take a look to see how large global American organizations, how their internal communications had evolved, and what they discovered. In fact, I think probably a nice way of putting it, they said that a lot of these organizations, that although they hadn't renamed their internal communications department as their internal conversation department, that's what they'd effectively done. They were turning the communication into a two-way communication, i.e. a conversation, rather than a one-way. And there's a big conference coming up in Vancouver in August. This guy here, Gervais Bush, is a professor of organizational development at University in Vancouver. And he and a partner have developed something that they called dialogic OD. So looking at organizational development through the lens of conversation and dialogue. So there's some interesting things going on in the world that kind of segue into some of my thinking.